Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual public program, Politics and Memory, Civil War Monuments in Gilded Age, New York, with author Akela Reason. This is our first public program of the fall, and we're grateful to all of you for joining us this evening, including those of you who originally planned to come in person. The American Antiquarian Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, which remains a vibrant presence in central Massachusetts today. I'm Scott Casper, president of the American Antiquarian Society. Our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources we've been collecting since 1812. In addition to welcoming researchers to use our collections, both physical and digital, we host programs like tonight's that tell us more about the past and also help us think about its resonance for our own day. My colleague Lauren Havelis is coordinating our technology this evening. She'll be sharing information in the chat about, for example, how to order the book, how you can put questions for our author in the Q&A. You can do that at any point during the program. I should also mention that this program is being recorded and it will be on our YouTube channel shortly after it's done. We thank you for joining us this evening. And as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you might provide to help us keep this work going. Thank you. Ever since colonists tore down the monument of King George III in New York's Bowling Green in 1776, monuments have been a topic of controversy and interest in American history. This, of course, is something we know very well today because of the ongoing conflicts and controversies surrounding Civil War monuments. And our speaker tonight has fascinatingly told the story of those monuments in a place we don't usually think about them, which is New York City. Akela Reason is Associate Professor of History and Director of the Interdisciplinary Certificate in Museum Studies at the University of Georgia. She studies American visual and material culture. Her first book, Thomas Eakins and the Uses of History, won the 2011 Southeastern College Conference Award for Excellence in Scholarly Research and Publication. She has written for many journals and, most fascinatingly, I think, has worked at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the High Museum of Art. So she really has a background both in the scholarly work of history and art history, and also in the ongoing work of making that history accessible to people through the museum world. Her brand new book is called Politics and Memory, Civil War Monuments in Gilded Age, New York, and it's a pleasure to welcome Akela Reason here virtually to the American Antiquarian Society. Akela, over to you.
Hi, thanks. Before I get started, I just want to apologize. I'm in the South, and in the late evening, late afternoon, we sometimes get these pop-up thunderstorms. We're having a big one right now. So you may occasionally hear loud booms, which is always unexpected. All right. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. I'd like to thank Nan and Lauren and Scott for inviting me to speak about my book, Politics and Memory, Civil War Monuments in Gilded Age, New York. The book examines the intersection of politics and aesthetics in the building of New York City's soldiers' monuments from roughly 1862 to 1902. And if you know anything about this period, it's really well known for its political corruption. And as it turns out, monument building is not exempt from such political machinations. I'm going to start the talk by giving kind of a brief overview of the project and address some of the bigger ideas that I try to get at in the book before digging into the history of the monument that graces the cover of the book, which is the Brooklyn Soldiers and Sailors Monument. So I came to this project really for two reasons. It kind of grew out of my previous book project on Thomas Eakins, which sounds like a stretch if you know anything about the realist painter. But he actually contributed to two major public monuments, including the Brooklyn Soldiers and Sailors Monument. And it was in the process of doing research for this book that I really got my first glimpse of the kinds of political scheming that was endemic in the building of New York soldiers' monuments. The book also grows out of my teaching in the South, and I'm a Yankee by birth. I grew up on Long Island, and so I'm not a native here in the South. And I quickly learned that, of course, Confederate monuments dominate the commemorative landscape down here. There's, of course, been lots and lots of scholarship about Confederate monuments over the past 3 decades. And these monuments have also been subject to public controversy in recent years, and they've really kind of dominated our conversation about what monuments are of this period. But surprisingly, Union monuments have been a bit less thoroughly examined, and I think this is probably for a couple of reasons. One is that historians' understanding of Union monuments has been derived mostly from textual sources, and those sources tend to suggest that post-war Northerners rejected triumphant rhetoric in favor of reconciliation with the South, and hence the monuments probably should show this as well. In contrast, Confederate monuments are an embodiment of the lost cause, which is an ideology that allowed Southerners to proclaim victory in the face of military defeat by maintaining the righteousness of their cause. For a variety of reasons, the Union states don't have anything quite as potent as the lost cause, and so they lack a singular ideology to undergird their monuments. Another reason why Union monuments have been less well studied is that there's this kind of puzzling belief that because Union monuments look very similar to Confederate monuments, that they're more or less the same, and there's really not anything new to learn from looking at Union monuments. However, since most of the infrastructure of monument building in this period is rooted in the North, and particularly in New York City, I'm talking about the art academies, the foundries, the professional organizations, the exhibition venues, and even the lower end monument manufacturers who are shipping kind of mass-produced monuments. They're all based in the North. And I think you really need to start there to understand war monuments of this period. So I'm going to just suggest a couple of ways in which I feel like New York soldiers' monuments differ from Southern examples. One of the things that's really kind of critical throughout the study is that the monuments that I'm looking at are the city's soldiers' monuments. So the ones that the city paid for to honor its the soldiers who fought for the war. And in New York City, the vast majority of these are built by the city with city funds. If you know anything about Confederate monuments, those tend to be spearheaded by ladies' organizations, groups like Ladies' Memorial Associations or the United Daughters of the Confederacy. That is not the case in New York City, where these are all publicly funded. Now, with public funding, we have some issues of municipal corruption being involved in the process of the building of these monuments. But we also, through public funding, have a kind of double-edged sword here, in that we have a kind of beneficial point in that because this is public money, these monuments are also shaped by public opinion in certain ways that they are not in the South. The South uses a much more kind of autocratic model through these private associations. Also, interestingly, because the monuments in New York City are really kind of produced at the behest of politicians, the politicians really aren't that interested in the iconographic content, the imagery that's used. And so artists are granted significant control over the iconography of the monuments, which is really, I think, very interesting for something so potentially ideologically charged. So I've already mentioned that the North lacks a kind of cohesive ideology like the lost cause, and some see this as a significant problem with Northern commemoration and find it as sort of muted commemoration rather than more celebratory. But what I see with the lack of a cohesive ideology is that this actually is liberatory in the sense in New York City, where it really allows a wide range of options for depicting Union victory, including a triumphal arch. Another difference in New York City from the South is that its monuments, this is, kind of a period of efflorescence of monument building in the North. And New York's monuments exist in a landscape that's full of other monuments that are built to other purposes, and these monuments are in dialogue with one another and sometimes affect siting or even you know, how monuments get built in terms of funding. This is a period in which the City Beautiful movement thrives, and this is an effort to kind of beautify cities and rationalize them. And in places like New York City, which is really a key center of the City Beautiful movement, we see lots and lots of monument building and architectural projects and park beautification, which we don't really have comparable examples of in the South. And then a final point that I think is not always taken into account is that the study that the book ends at 1902, and that's when the last major New York City Civil War monument is built, at least to the Soldiers Monument. New York actually embraces other wars. I mean, they're not defined by the Civil War in quite the same way that the South is, and so veterans of other wars have monuments built. They, use the Civil War monuments differently because of commemoration of those wars, and even Civil War monuments find themselves co-opted in this way and used as celebration and commemoration of other wartime activities. Before I get into the kind of heart of the case studies and the meat of the book, I just want to lay out a few things about New York City in this period because it's a bit different than it is today. This is a contemporary map of New York City showing you the five boroughs as they exist today. But this is a construct that didn't exist until 1898. Before 1898, the city of New York mostly meant Manhattan and parts of the Bronx. Brooklyn was a completely independent city and actually the third largest city in the nation in 1880, behind New York City and Philadelphia. Since the municipalities of the five boroughs were not organized into one city until 1898, the modern city of New York has multiple soldiers' monuments. Which I think is really interesting. And it gives us kind of this arc where we can see the development of soldiers' monuments buildings in the building of soldiers' monuments across the boroughs in New York City. It's also important to keep in mind that Manhattan is an island, and it was not connected to Brooklyn via bridges until 1883. So access to the city's very earliest monuments, which were built in cemeteries in Brooklyn and Queens, was really required multiple modes of transportation to get there. So you would take a ferry to a streetcar line, and then there would be some walking in between. And so it was not an immediate thing to get to those monuments. And then one further point of business to note is that while we associate the Union and its Confederate commemoration with the Republican Party of Lincoln, New York and Brooklyn were mostly run by Southern sympathizing Democratic politicians, and it's largely Democratic machine politicians who are building the city's Union monuments. As I've noted, the artists are given a lot of latitude, so this doesn't really seem to impact the iconography of the building of the monuments themselves, but it does open the monuments up to opportunities for graft as their construction coincides with this heyday of municipal corruption and spoils system patronage. So let's see some monuments. When I started this project, I had not expected that I would begin in the 1850s. I assumed that monument building would begin after the war. But in fact, the book starts with this monument to Mexican-American War Commander William Jenkins Worth, for whom places like Fort Worth in Texas are named for. This monument was built in 1857, and it's important for a couple of reasons in the book. This is the first monument that the city actually commissions and builds. It's not the first public monument in the city, but it's the first one that the city pays for. And so, as such, it provides a model for subsequent monuments. So the earliest soldiers' monuments were modeled upon this precedent. The city's earliest soldiers' monuments are these two, which are in cemeteries, again, in Queens and Brooklyn. The one on the left here is uh, the Soldiers Monument in Calvary Cemetery, which is a Catholic cemetery. So it had somewhat restrictive burial practices. And the one on the right is a monument, the Soldiers Monument in Greenwood Cemetery. And these were built under a system that awarded contracts to the lowest bidders. This was the same system that was used to build any kind of municipal infrastructure, like sewers. There were no aesthetic considerations involved. There were no artists who weighed in on this, but there were ample opportunities for graft. And in this particular duo of monuments, you can probably make it out. I don't know if you can see my cursor here. This figure here is a cavalryman. There he is again. The same figures are used on both monuments. All four figures that appear on the cavalry monument were reproduced for the Greenwood monument. This does not appear to have been by design in terms of what the city thought they were purchasing. And also both monuments uh, were sold to the city. The embellishments, the sculptural details on the monuments were sold to the city as being made of bronze. In fact, everything was made of zinc, and the zinc was apparently painted so that it looked like bronze. So they were definitely trying to kind of bilk the city out of some money here, and convince them that they were getting something that they were not, something more costly and more refined. Just as a point, if there are historians out here, you'll notice that on both of these monuments that they appear to be made of bronze, and that is because that they were replaced later on in the 20th century, and in the 21st century, replicas were made of these. The Worth Monument, as I mentioned, is important for two reasons. It provides us the model for the building of these monuments, but it also is located at an intersection of Broadway and Fifth Avenue near Madison Square Park. And because the first monuments that New York City builds to its soldiers are in cemeteries outside of the city proper, the Worth Monument kind of becomes a de facto Civil War monument in the long period before Manhattan completes its own Soldiers Monument, which is in 1902. So parades march past the Worth Monument. There are grandstands set up there. There's all kinds of activities that are associated with that monument, and it is decorated on Memorial Day, during Memorial Day processions and parades, and then from those, the veterans groups make their way to the cemeteries across the river in Brooklyn and Queens. So now I'm going to talk about this monument, which I think is one of the most elegant monuments of the period. I think it's one of the most impressive monumental works. It looks impressive, but it's almost an accident that it came together as seamlessly as it did, because nothing was really planned, in part because of this kind of chaotic process of municipal monument commissions. Um, the desire to build monuments in Brooklyn really began with Brooklyn Mayor Seth Low, who was a Republican. Oftentimes, the political offices were filled with Democratic politicians. Low was a kind of reform Republican who came in for this brief window, and as he was new to the mayoralty, he gave a Memorial Day address at the monument in Greenwood Cemetery here. And he drew attention to the fact that the soldiers' monument around which the crowd had gathered had actually been erected by the city of New York, rival to Brooklyn, to honor its own dead. Seizing the moment, Lowe decided to promise his audience that since Brooklyn had built no comparable monument to its soldiers, he proposed to not let another Memorial Day pass without such a monument in Brooklyn. And within days of his oration, the Brooklyn city government began to put the wheels in motion to build a monument. And Lowe, being a kind of aesthete and a reformer, kind of put sand in the gears by saying that he didn't want the city to build this monument. He wanted to build this monument by subscription, which was a time-honored practice for building monuments, whereby people contribute money to a fund, and then eventually, once the fund, kind of reaches its goal, you then start the building campaign of the monument. The problem was that while this is a common method in the antebellum period, it also was not a very successful one oftentimes. These building campaigns often failed, where they, didn't raise enough money, and the monuments either didn't get built in a timely fashion or they didn't get built at all. To his credit, Lowe was probably trying to avoid entangling the monuments in the machine politics that led to the very shoddy workmanship of the monument that he'd been standing in front of when he gave this oration. But nonetheless, he claimed that this was going to be a huge success, and he persevered and went on. And eventually, the city commissioned a design from sculptor John Quincy Adams Ward, who brought architect Richard Morris Hunt to the project. And this is their design for the city of Brooklyn's monument. And just to give you a sense of the scale, there's some people in this drawing. This is a spectator way down here, a little tiny guy, who's giving you a sense of how big those sculptural elements are. So it's got this kind of like central shaft with a drum with sculpture around it. And it's a quite ambitious monument. It would likely have been one of the largest and most expensive monuments of the 19th century. It includes multiple complex figural groups. Down below, there were to be multi-figured groups depicting the branches of the armed services. There were military commanders on horseback up at this level. And then at the top, the crowning figures are a kind of angel of peace intervening between two opponents, one of whom is clearly defeated, a not so veiled reference to the conflict between North and South. And then yet there were other areas in which sculpture would contribute to this design. And unfortunately, this is the presentation watercolor that Richard Morris Hunt presented to the city of Brooklyn for this design. We know that they worked on it subsequently and made a few changes, but we have a lot of textual descriptions, but we don't have a lot of detailed imagery to show us things like what is on this drum here, this relief sculpture. But we do know some of the themes that Ward intended to include, and they were really quite astonishing in certain ways. They innovated in terms of subject matter, including depictions of women in the war in one of the friezes. This would have been a frieze that would have been placed lower on the monument. So highly visible. There was supposed to be women in the war, emancipation, and on the large frieze in the center here, this was to include in its final iteration in a model that was presented to the public and written about in the newspaper, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. The scene there was described as, quote, an allegory of liberty, pointing out to the enfranchised Negro groups that carry the relief around the column and that typify science, art, agriculture, industry, and education. This subject was completely without precedent. Union monuments sometimes include emancipation scenes, but none allude to what happens after that point. The idea of Black citizenship is never addressed. So Ward's groundbreaking composition would have shown a Black citizen actually receiving the benefits due to all free men. Brooklyn would likely not have been prepared for this image, yet there's no indication that this was the real problem with the demise of this design, which obviously was never built. The monument was felled by much more prosaic concerns. The city had hoped, or this was Lowe's dream, to allocate $250,000 or to raise $250,000, which is a pretty staggering sum in this period. It's 8.5 million. And this money had not been raised. But the design that Ward and Hunt submitted had a price tag of $500,000, which was so substantial that the city had no prayer of funding this through subscription or otherwise. Local politics also played a little bit of a role in the termination of this contract, as a new Democratic administration came in and wanted to have control of the project. And very soon after that, Ward's project is kind of tossed aside, and the city's Democratic aldermen take over, and they hold an open design competition with a much, much reduced budget. And they ultimately select this design by the artist Henry Bayer, who is trying to kind of maybe pick up some of the pieces of Ward's design, but really kind of trim it down a great deal. Nothing so edgy as having depictions of women or emancipation or even Black citizenship in it. Down below are people engaged, soldiers engaged in like leave taking scenes, and then up at the top is a figure of Brooklyn. Most of the critics who saw the proposals that had been submitted in this competition thought that they were fairly derivative and looked like sort of cheap knockoffs of what they saw in other cities. But nonetheless, the aldermen decided to press forward and issue this contract. And what happens next is incredibly complicated, and I don't fully understand it because there are bits and pieces. It's like there are multiple players and they each tell a different story. But it's really indicative of the political environment in which New York's monuments were built, because within days of receiving the contract, Bayer was accused of having bribed the aldermen to receive the contract. And I'm not entirely certain who was to gain from this, but I have a suspicion that it was conflict between the mayor and the aldermen, and that Bayer had just been caught between these two factions in this kind of internecine political conflict between these various factions. And in the end, Bayer's contract was rescinded, and yet another competition was held, which resulted more or less in the arch that exists today. Prior to the launch of this next competition that selects this design, public opinion in Brooklyn had really kind of shifted away from those shaft-style monuments, like the cemetery monuments, where it's basically a column with some sculptural embellishment. And so the press, citizens groups, veterans groups, and some powerful politicians all favored the idea of building an arch of some sort, in part based on one that's in Hartford's Bushnell Park. They used that as a kind of model for like, we should do something different, like Hartford did. So maybe not so different. The competition's winning design here was submitted by an architect named John Hemingway Duncan. And he is also the same architect who designed Grant's tomb, which was more or less around the same time. Duncan's design was submitted blind under the moniker Red Seal and was selected by a jury of 2 architects, so a much more professionalized process from those earlier monuments. And as you can see, Duncan's design was a kind of classically influenced Beaux-Arts design with multi-figured sculptural groups on the piers. And in his original submission, it had a quadriga at the top, which is a kind of chariot with 4 horses pulling the chariot. He was asked at this stage, when he submitted this design, to remove the quadriga in order to save costs. that was eventually restored. There were also going to be on the interiors of the arch, inside the piers, there were going to be statues of soldiers on niches, basically kind of representing the armed services again in there. And while the triumphal arch form is associated with war, you know, the monument would have needed the iconography of those sculptural groups to really kind of bind it to the American Civil War. But remarkably, Duncan never indicated what the peer groups would depict, nor who would execute the sculpture, which are two kind of critical things that one would need to know in order to understand what the sculptural program is about. And indeed, the sculptural program for the arch was not established until many years after it was completed. And in fact, the arch, here you see it between 1892 and 1895, it was at one point, it was built, and there was virtually no sculptural adornments on it at all. Typically, veterans were quite upset about this, but typically the way building on this project worked, and it took some time just to get to the construction of the arch itself. But typically what happened is that the progress on the monument generally coincided with the election cycle. So a few months before the election, there'd be a flurry of activity, new commissions, something would be done. And then right after the election, there would be nothing. And in some cases, veterans complained that there was just scattered debris and boxes of crates and things like that that were left behind. And that they were not able to use the monument in their celebrations, which is what they really wanted this for. They wanted this to be a focal point of their commemorative activities. One other thing to note, which we'll get to in a little bit, is that there are doors here on the inside of the arch, and it's actually a building. You can go up inside the arch, and the veterans wanted that because they wanted to use the interior spaces as a kind of meeting space and also to hold relics and records of their veterans associations. So there's no sculpture until these show up, and they really do kind of surprise everyone. So these are two sculptures, and these are ones that I worked on in my first book by William Rudolph O'Donovan and Thomas Akins, and they show Lincoln and Grant on horseback. Lincoln is not an elegant figure on horseback. He looks his sort of tall, lanky frame, is somewhat awkward in this position. But that aside, this was arrives in Brooklyn, and they put them on the arch, and no one seems to have been prepared really for their arrival. And there's a lot of criticism in the press of these, which sort of some of the discussion that comes out of this is that the idea of taking monuments down is not so new. Some of what the citizens write in about these relief sculptures is that they would like to see them melted down or placed. One critic sort of cheekily says that he thinks that they should be removed to an asylum for the blind so that no one could see them. There's a lot of discussion about how to deal with these works that the city had not anticipated, and they had not anticipated them because these sculptures were basically subcontracted by the architect. So under the architect's contract, he gave the commission to actually the foundry owner, Judge Maurice Power, who was also a political party boss in Manhattan. He was head of the county democracy. And so he commissioned these, and they formed a very small part of the record keeping in that period. They weren't even really, they were not published in the newspapers as an action taken by the city government when the commissions were granted. So no one had anticipated that these would arrive. These were not the only irregularities that happened in this project, and there was an extended expose in October 1894 in the New York Tribune talking about the irregularities of the Monument Commission and accused it of wrongdoing, corruption, graft, and a deliberate attempt to hide its records by not keeping a minute book. Um, and here is Maurice Power, who I am just absolutely fascinated by. He was an Irish immigrant, came to the United States as a small boy, ended up apprenticing with a stonecutter, and became eventually a foundry owner. The image that he's using here on his advertisement for his National Fine Art Foundry is actually the sculpture that is on the Calvary and Greenwood monuments, because he was the contractor for that who had built the city out of funding there on those two monuments and cheated them by providing them with zinc instead of bronze. Power had a reputation for being so corrupt that he had even cheated Boss Tweed, the notorious kind of political crony who built the city out of tons of money. So those panels are placed on the arch, they're put there, and the city can't figure out how to get out of the contract or what to do with artwork that you don't want. So they end up keeping them there. But a Republican administration comes in, and they finally commission the large monumental multi-figured sculptures that go on the piers and the top on the roof, the quadriga and the two pier sculptures from the Brooklyn-born sculptor Frederick McMonnies. And what McMonnies ultimately chose to do is he created a quadriga with Columbia in the chariot, and then on the left he has Army, a group representing Army, and on the right a group representing Navy. McMonnies had not originally planned to represent those groups on the piers. And in fact, this gives you some insight into how complicated this commission was. He was not aware that those relief sculptures were going to be on the monument, and had initially conceived of the idea of creating his own Lincoln and Grants on horseback, which he was going to put on the piers and also execute the quadriga. So he drew up these images and they were published in the newspaper. He made actually a model showing the configuration of these figures. And they were kind of discussed pretty widely in the press, which seemed completely unaware of the fact that the other works had been commissioned. Fortunately, McMonnies at this point was working closely with the architect Stanford White, and Stanford White hated these. He hated the idea of having the figures who had to face one another. He didn't like having the horses that way. And he encouraged McMonnies to think about other designs. And then also, ultimately, once the panels were with the relief panels were installed, McMonnies had to choose something else, and he ultimately chose these subjects of Army and Navy, which McMonnies was Brooklyn born, so the Brooklyn press loved him, but he also had a studio in Paris, which made him, a very cosmopolitan aesthete, a local boy made done good. And McMonnies based some of his compositions on those he was aware of in French art. So the Army is kind of loosely modeled upon Francois Rude's Departure of the Volunteers from the Arc de Triomphe. The Navy group critics who saw images of the design noted that it was much more placid and found it kind of unnervingly calm, and they weren't really sure what was going on in the group. But McMonnies actually had a text in which he kind of described what he intended for these subjects to be. And he noted that this was a group of men who were about to and their ship was about to be boarded by Confederates. And so facing this kind of imminent conflict, the men are supposed to be shown as pensive and steeling themselves for armed combat. And to my mind, none perhaps none is more ready than the young black sailor kneeling next to the mortar on the left. And this figure, I think, is one of the most important figures in American art of this period. His significance has been somewhat dismissed by scholars for a couple of reasons. One is he's part, his torso is bare. He's nude, partially nude. He's in this kneeling posture, which some have seen as indicating stereotypical kind of subservience to the white crewman behind him. Um, and then others have argued that his placement on a ship, rather than in the army, also indicates that his role is kind of marginal. Yet there's one detail which is difficult to see here, but there's one detail in this image that I think makes it really kind of extraordinary, and that is that he is holding a weapon in his hand, a pistol, and that weapon is cocked and ready to use. And given McMoney's narrative, he's going to be using that weapon in close combat, fighting against white Confederates who are boarding his ship. He's not the only armed Black figure to appear on Civil War monuments, but to my knowledge, none are depicted as so obviously ready to fight. For example, McMoney's was a pupil of Augustus St. Gaudens, and then later on a friend of his. And in fact, St. Gaudens helped him to get the commission for the Brooklyn Arch. But St. Gaudens is really well known for this monument, the Shaw Memorial, which is dedicated to uh, Robert Gould Shaw, the commander of the Massachusetts 54th, and his troops who are shown behind him marching down Beacon Street. Now, all of those men, this is a Black regiment, the Massachusetts 54th, of volunteers who are heading to the South. And they're all bearing weapons, but they are, their arms are shouldered. None is actively ready to use them, and prepared to take a life in quite the same way as McMoney's young sailor. One thing I think is also compelling about this is the sailor's lower position in the composition, which some see as potentially subservient to the other figures there, also places him in closer proximity to the viewer, who is below him and looking up at him, which is perhaps a kind of counterweight. I would also argue that the figure's placement on a ship as a sailor is also quite notable, because although Black men served in far greater numbers in the Union Army than they did in the Navy couldn't segregate in quite the same way. Black sailors had to served on ships with white crewmen, and since their labor was skilled, they also received equal pay, whereas Black soldiers did not. All of these, to me, make this figure more suggestive of the implications of Black citizenship than most sculptors ever attempted. So what did Brooklynites think? Reception of this figure is really hard to gauge. He's mentioned in several press notices, which very clearly indicate that they view him as a sailor rather than as a contraband former slave. But unfortunately, that's pretty much all they say about him. Instead, much greater criticism, very virulent, was leveled at the female allegorical figure behind the grouping, which represents the spirit of the Navy, and she's back here. Many writers, critics, characterize this figure as completely inappropriate, grotesque, coarse. Many viewed her as being just kind of not allegorical, but as a vivid depiction of a model of a kind of loose woman. And that didn't really go anywhere because otherwise they'd have to, decline the piece. But nonetheless, there was at least some criticism directly leveled at this for a particular reason, not that the depiction of the sailor. One of the things that, in terms of the veterans' usage of this monument, that one should keep in mind is that these sculptures did not arrive at once. They all arrived in different stages, piecemeal. And so Veterans who had been hoping to see their arch adorned and used in parades would have been disappointed because Quadriga arrived first and was put on the arch in 1898. And Army was put on the arch in 1900, and then Navy in 1901. So it was in these stages, all of which occurred effectively after the conclusion of the Spanish-American War. And veterans of that war were among the first to make use of the arch in their commemorative ceremonies, which disappointed many of the veterans who'd so long waited, the Civil War veterans who'd so long waited to see this arch completed so that they could use it in their own ceremonies. But of course, by the time this was done, by the time this was completed, many of those veterans were aging and unable to participate in the parades, at least the lengthier parades, and often needed support of their grandchildren, or at least this is what is mentioned in the press, is that the route is sometimes shortened for them and that they're given positions so that they don't have to walk as far. Another complicating factor for the completion of this is that this was begun by the mayor of Brooklyn for the city of Brooklyn to honor Brooklyn soldiers. By the time it's completed in 1901, Brooklyn is not independent anymore and has now been absorbed into greater New York. And so Brooklynites are New Yorkers. And so who does this commemorate? Does this still commemorate Brooklyn soldiers, or is it a broader monument to all New Yorkers? So these are the sorts of things that kind of play out when you see a monument built over such a long period of time. I just have a few concluding slides here. The arch, as I mentioned earlier, is really a building. And so when you have a building, lots of bad things can happen structurally to it. And the roof has leaked since the 19th century. There have been periodic campaigns of restoration. And I am very happy to say that the most recent was completed in June of this year. The city completed an 8.9 million restoration, doing a lot of interior structural work, but also cleaning up the sculptures and removing a lot of vegetation that had started to grow out of some of the nooks and crannies of the monument. And so it's in its most glorious appearance that it hasn't looked this good in decades. So if you have an opportunity to go see it, please take a look. It's right outside of Prospect Park. Enjoy a day in Brooklyn and take a peek at the arch. But that's all I have, and I thank you for your attention and be happy to answer questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Akela. That was fascinating. The book is absolutely fascinating. You deal with several other monuments besides the ones that you talked about this evening. I'll start with a question from myself, which is really connected to your title about politics and memory. There's a lot of politics here. My question is, when I think about the Civil War, one of the stories that comes through your book is what's not happening in New York, which is I don't get the sense that very many people were really passionate about the Civil War the way they were in the South. It's like, there aren't a lot of people who are like pushing for um, something to honor the Civil War veterans. So it ends up in the hands of the politicians and in some ways in the hands of artists,
Mhm.
more than in the hands of the kind of groups in the South that you see that are pushing. It gets back to your point about ideology at the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are veterans groups that are certainly invested in seeing these monuments, and some of these veterans groups that, there are Grand Army of the Republic organizations all across the city, all of these groups, and sometimes they've begun monument campaigns. They've started small campaigns to try to build monuments, but the problem is that these groups tend not to be able to raise the kinds of sums that are needed to build substantial monuments. Some of them do things like erect smaller monuments in cemeteries. And so actually one of the infantrymen from the Calvary and Greenwood Monument is also represented in the city in Woodlawn Cemetery because a Grand Army unit decided to have that erected there. But in general, no, the soldiers don't get a real say, which is kind of interesting.
It's really interesting. Yeah. It suggests, and what's interesting too is that New York is something very different, as you mentioned. It is becoming a center of the arts.
Mhm.
Um, and so in some ways, and you talk about the process by which artists and architects become part of those commissions, the city commissions, to figure out what these monuments are going to be.
Yes, it becomes a powerhouse in the arts. It becomes kind of the center of the art world following the war in the United States. But then also across the period, by the time you get to the 1890s, the artists are also forming professional organizations that are effectively kind of lobbying groups so that they can organize to get these commissions and spearhead, campaigns to build monuments. So they're definitely very much involved in the process.
Nice. We have some questions coming in from our audience, so I'll ask a few of them to you. Some of them are specific questions like who funded the restoration of the monument that you talk about at the end? Is that a city funded thing?
Yes, that was a city funded thing. And I have to just mention in that image is Jonathan Kuhn, who's director of art and antiquities for New York City. He manages thousands of monuments across the city, and he was involved in that project. Also, the Prospect Park Alliance was involved, and the various alliances and conservancies across the city are also very important to the conservation of monuments across all the boroughs.
Yeah. Uh, we've got some more great questions are coming in. Thanks for all these questions. Nell Painter asks, what about the depiction of Europeans in the Union forces? Irishmen? Yeah, that's a really great question. When we think about the multi-ethnic Union armies, do they find their way into these monuments at all?
It's interesting because there sometimes is discussion in Confederate monuments about, a monument looking too German or something. But there's not a lot of discussion of ethnicity in any of the criticism that I read about. But the Irish, I mean, Power and Duncan, the architect of the arch, and the sculptor William Rudolph O'Donovan are this kind of like Irish power faction that work together. Um, and they also have ties to the Confederacy too. So they're not exactly pro-union in their outlook.
Yeah. Stephen Sanfilippo asks a similar question. My maternal German immigrant great-great-grandfather fought for the Union in a German Brooklyn regiment. He was wounded at Gettysburg. Are there German monuments? Germans were the largest group in the Union Army. I'm a fifth generation Brooklynite Navy veteran. Thanks for your presentation. That's really interesting. Any German monuments in New York or elsewhere for that matter?
I know that there are definitely German monuments in the Midwest, Union monuments. I'm not aware. I mean, I was really focused on the city-sponsored soldiers monument, so I don't know all of the monuments throughout the city. And just to be clear, I mean, there are many Civil War monuments in New York, and my focus was not on commanders' monuments or regimental monuments or those sorts of things. And the regimental monuments is probably where you're more likely going to see some of those ethnic groups because they often kind of congregated in particular regiments. But one German connection that I'm aware of is that there's one monument that's the final monument in the study, which is the New York Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Riverside Park. And I did find evidence that the first keeper of that monument was a wounded soldier who was German, who was there to open it up, apparently. He didn't live, I think he died in like 1906 and the monument opened in 1902, so he wasn't there very long. And I don't have any evidence that he was replaced.
And that story, that's a very interesting story. It's a story toward the end of your book about this monument in Riverside Park that has had kind of a sad afterlife. It's sort of, it's been a bit abandoned, really, it sounds like.
Well, the city is restoring it, and that one is also a huge issue because it's a structure. It's a building. It's a Tholos temple. It too has problems with drainage and a leaking roof and retaining wall issues, and also it's got a big plaza, and so the cost of that restoration is far more substantial than the Brooklyn Arch.
Yeah, and the Riverside Park turned out to be more of a residential area, so it became less of the kind of central focus. Lynn says, it's interesting to me how the monuments you talk about are so different from the mostly earlier monuments erected in small northern towns, which list the names of the dead and the battles that involve local boys. These smaller monuments feel like they're mourning at least as much as they are celebrating victory. Is there any element of mourning to these large urban monuments?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think there certainly is. In that, we have to think about the generations that use them and how they use them. So for us, these are more triumphant. But if you were of that generation, you'd probably also feel a somberness to some of the representation, particularly the Lincoln, that those relief sculptures with the Lincoln with his hat off. I mean, a lot of critics complained about seeing the inside of the hat, but part of it was that Lincoln was taking his hat off to the troops who would march through the monument. So, like, the rituals too associated with these were connected with mourning and were kind of detached from those rituals because they were a bit different from how we engage with the monuments now.
Yeah, yeah. Wendy Bellion asks, New York, who of course has written about iconoclasm in New York. New York has such a long history of iconoclasm or other contentious responses to public monuments. Did you encounter any such examples of vandalism or iconoclasm in the monuments you researched?
Yes. It's not a major feature of the book because I don't really kind of delve into this period, but it seems that starting in the 1920s, 30s, that there is significant vandalism, in a time of economic downturn, that these monuments do experience, graffiti, you know, people breaking off pieces. Now, in the case of the cemetery monuments that I was talking about, the one in Greenwood has relief sculptures on it. And those panels were the original panels were actually stolen in the 1980s. So in cemetery monuments are very prone to that kind of vandalism and particularly in that kind of long history in the 20th century, people would pry off these metal elements and sell them for scrap. So there's lots of damage, and you could even see it in the Calvary Monument. There was a cross there that's been removed, and they're missing eagles that were once part of that monument. So a lot of it's 20th century damage. I don't know about during, the late 19th century, whether any of that was happening.
Yeah. We have a question from Jerry about the Brooklyn Soldiers and Sailors Monument by Richard Morris Hunt. Do you know which parts he worked on? Jerry writes, he was responsible for the base of the Statue of Liberty, so wondering if his part had to do with the base in this monument.
So he contributed to the design that was seen in that watercolor. And he would have, I presume, now he had a pretty close working relationship with the sculptor John Quincy Adams Ward. And I presume that he would have been behind most of the kind of layout of the kind of supporting structures and the kind of the platforms upon which the sculptures stood. So that was the one that has all those multi-figured compositions and the relief sculptures. So as far as I know, John Quincy Adams Ward, had control over all the sculpture. And I would assume that Richard Morris Hunt probably did the rest.
Right. Very interesting. We have two more questions. One of them is about your method, and another is about teaching. Arika Smith says, I noticed you referenced some of the sources of your research for the Brooklyn Monument on the slides for the drafts. You also mentioned books and old newspapers from the time. Are there any more sources for the historical research done on the monuments? This book is full of footnotes, so it's a ton of sources. Can you just maybe just tell us about some of the
Yeah.
kinds of sources you used?
Yeah. So one interesting thing about this project is that almost none of the monuments that I write about have full records. So there's no archival sources like for most of the monument projects. There are scattered archival sources like in artist papers and things like that. But a lot of what I used were historic newspapers. Um, and, just kind of trying to dig to see wherever I could find a scrap that would lead me to the next thing. But this gives me an opportunity to also thank all of the archivists and librarians out there who are doing such good work, taking care of America's past in these times. But much of this book was written during COVID, and I would not have been able to complete it had those archivists and, librarians not helped me out and scan things for me when I couldn't be in an archive.
Love hearing that coming from the American Antiquarian Society. Of course. Our
You
last
also helped.
good. I'm glad to hear you do. Our last question is from Nathan Salomon, who says, "Hello, I'm a social studies teacher in Philly. How would you recommend educators teach about monuments?" And he thanks you for your talk this evening.
Wow. Um, I think that they should start by looking as a first step, because I think that physical things are a good way to get um, people thinking, especially with AI and, all of these kind of virtual experiences, that if we can actually see things and start to think about how we relate to them in space, and what kinds of things do we see, how do they make us feel, I think that those are important starts. um, and then, read around and see what you can find out about the intentions of the creators as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I used to teach in Nevada, and I taught a course on Civil War memory, and we found Civil War monuments in Nevada and took students out to them. And, what do you notice? What's going on here? And then we could compare that with what we read about from the Southern monuments and so on. And how might people in the West have thought about this differently? How might people in Philly have thought about this differently? So you can really think about the different, as well as the similarities between some of the soldier monuments. Akela Reason, thank you so much for this terrific talk. Really grateful for both your talk and your book, which I enjoyed immensely. I recommend it. You can get it from Yale University Press. To purchase a copy, Lauren has just put that information in the chat. If you'd like to share this program with friends, please tell them about it. It'll be available on our YouTube channel in the coming days. We have a great slate of programs coming up this fall at the American Antiquarian Society. Next week, we have Philip Gould. It's another virtual program. Philip Gould will be talking about his book, War Power, Literature and the State in the Civil War North. So a kind of Civil War theme continues next week. You can register for this and other programs on our website. Do check out our website because we've got programs almost every week for the next several months. Lots of possibilities. Please check them out. For now, thank you, Akela Reason. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and have a great evening.